I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. Welcome to Politely Pushy. As always, I'm your host, Eric Chemi. Nicole, thanks so much for joining me here on the show. You've done so much work around personal finance and how people are spending their money. And we're recording today, right before, just an hour before the Fed is going to cut rates. So, thanks for joining me today. And I'm curious to hear your perspective on what you've been doing here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to go over a little bit about how I ended up in the personal finance space, if that's interesting to you, or we can just go right into talking about financial topics.
No, definitely. How did you get here? Because I think that'll help our audience understand your path, what your passion is, what you're interested about, and how that informs what you're writing and reporting on.
Okay, well, I'll try to keep it brief, although it is rather extensive. I started out as a music journalist actually when I was about 19, so this was 40,000 years ago. Initially, I was writing, for indie online publications that maybe 8 people read in like the UK. So it became very apparent that I would never be able to support myself or my cat with this niche. So I then went on to a very
Could you have just supported only the cat, but not you?
no.
Like the cat's budget was more than what being
Yeah,
a music
yeah, my
journalist
cat,
is.
he had some health issues. My RIP fellow. I miss him every day.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I moved on to a very prestigious magazine called Grocery Headquarters, which is no longer
I
around.
haven't heard of them.
Yeah, it's nobody has, and it doesn't exist anymore, I believe. So it was a trade magazine. So my reporting was largely about, talking to store owners about challenges around their displays or their shelves. I didn't last too long. I guess I'll just skip ahead several years. I had the great opportunity of meeting some people at today.com, and I started working with them as a full-time contributor, covering a lot of pop culture, psychology, the royals, and mental health. Then I got with NBC News and was with them as a freelance writer for several years, working on business, tech, finance to an extent. Again, lots of psychology, mental health. And then all along that period, I was writing personal essays for like Vice, Vogue, Salon. That was really nourishing, but again, was not going to pay the bills. And then over the years,
Is it because you were freelance, or is it just the staff salaries weren't high enough?
Freelance was actually the only way for me to make it work because I could take on enough work to make it happen. These places just either weren't hiring, or I don't have a journalism degree, which is a
That
big.
was going to be my question. Is like you're doing a lot of things that it sounds like you're learning as you go. It's not like you had these courses or experiences before you actually started doing some of the things.
100%. Yeah, I really didn't. So I just would sort of get, I would desperately apply for a gig, get it, and then just figure it out. So over time, I met an editor at the New Yorker, Ben Greenman, who's one of my best friends now. And I started writing nightlife content for them. And that lasted a few years. It was total dream gig, but again, freelance. So eventually I found that the most consistent and frankly highest paying work was in the finance sector. I started freelancing for GOBankingRates, which not many people have heard of it. We're working on that, but it syndicates with Yahoo Finance, MSN, AOL, NASDAQ. So there's a very, very high chance that you've read a ton of GOBankingRates stories, but you've read them on our partner sites. That's just how it is.
Yeah, I've seen it, but I'm in this space, right? I've been in finance. I've been a financial journalist, so I'm definitely fully aware of them. So it's interesting you say, obviously, this helps pay the bills. It's a stable job in terms of what they pay. If all salaries were the same, though, would you still be doing this, or would you do music? Would you do mental health? Like what would be your true passion?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would be here. And I'm not just saying that because it's, the HR thing to say. It's a great job. I have a wonderful team. It's a super flexible and mom-friendly culture. Our CEO just loves promoting and supporting mothers. are all parents, and that's really important to me now that I have a 2-year-old and I have about 500 dogs. So, and we are respectably a very neutral space. We're not coming at you with big judgments or assumptions or extremism. So it's very conscientious journalism, and that's really fun and really important.
What's been the business model changing all of a sudden now, where AI can be writing stories or giving people advice? This whole idea of, do you need to have an ad supported model? Do you need a subscription model? A lot of online sites, they go down into the clickbait world. How have you and GOBankingRates tried to find that balance to make it work?
Um, I mean, it's a pretty high level strategy question. I think what I would just emphasize is that
Or how
we
has that high level strategy affected you in terms of what you're
right,
working on? Maybe I'll
right.
say it that way.
We do have to turn out quite a high rate of stories because we are constantly syndicating and we're constantly conducting our own research that we want to get out there. I produce about 16 stories a week, mostly reported stories. So, I mean, it's complex. We rely on several different ways to fund and grow the site, but what it comes down to is really producing quality content that provides actionable takeaways. So we're really honing our work to be something that anybody, whether they're a millionaire or they're making minimum wage, can get a lot out of and feel like they just got educated and have a little bit more of a plan.
You do 16 stories a week. How are you doing that? How do you spend enough time I remember when I worked at Bloomberg and I knew the businessweek.com people, they wrote 15 stories a week. So it was 3 stories a day, 5 days a week. So they
Mhm.
basically did a story every 3 hours.
Yeah.
And I thought that was crazy. And they wouldn't move from their desk the whole day, right? They just crank out story. It was basically like, let's say, you know, 9 to 12, 12 to 3, and 3 to 6 p.m. Those were their stories that they cranked out. So now you say 16, which is one more than 15. How are you budgeting your time to do that?
It's not as hard as it as it sounds. When I came on, I was a little overwhelmed myself, but I was doing the same, I realized, more or less as a freelancer with them, but it just made sense. I may as well be full time and have this, security and benefits. Um, we're lucky in that we can file our stories pretty much any time in the day we want. So, for instance, last night I couldn't sleep, and I'm kind of like a border collie. Like if I'm not working, I'll just eat the furniture. So I was really bored and anxious, and so I just wrote 2 stories, and filed them this morning. So we're not penciled into a schedule. And again, with the flexibility, if I want to take my kid to daycare or do some other parental activity, I have the bandwidth and the space to do that. It's really just about like extreme discipline, doing a ton of reporting on one day instead of doing reporting every day. I usually know what I'm going to work on at least 3 days in advance, so I have time to build up my sourcing.
So what are you working on right now, as an example?
I am working on some political pieces, which I'm not going to get into yet because I don't yet know the direction of where they're going. I'm always doing some retail stories. I do a lot of real estate stories. I do a lot of state by state stories in terms of, this is the cheapest place to live right now, or this is the most expensive place to buy a home. Again, all of them have the goal of being really approachable, really actionable, informative, and of course, straying far away from that clickbait angle, which fortunately, some publications are getting a lot savvier about not accepting. So I do see a positive trend there.
What is a story, let's say in the last few weeks, that's already been published, that's already out, that you were particularly surprised about when you were reporting on, that maybe you started one way and ended up going in a different direction?
Let me think for 2 seconds. I did a piece that just published about the $35 trillion debt that our country embarrassingly carries. I think that we tend to think this debt is outside of our control, but I think we think it's outside of affecting us. In fact, it's poised to come slamming down largely on the middle class and lower income Americans. So I was surprised to learn just how dramatically that affects inflation and other costs of living. I think I was, like many, sort of naively expecting it to be more of a higher level issue that doesn't trickle down on us, but it absolutely does.
I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day, and it said the newest big group of people who are renting their homes are millionaires. That it's getting to the point where even they are unable to buy the right home or afford the right home, and it's showing this right, like all this debt that's piling up and what it means for things are at overinflated prices. It's skewing the way that people can relate to buying things for themselves. What's been your perspective as some of these trends have changed, where we're seeing, okay, higher interest rates, but that means the debt is more expensive, right? And the debt usually is all the things that people want to buy that the government is subsidizing, right? Whether it's education or healthcare or housing, we see a lot of debt just related to a lot of those three things.
Yeah, well, I think what maybe one way to approach this question is to discuss why it feels like things are so expensive right now. And when we talk about debt, we have to talk about the pandemic, which, by the way, is not over. People in the US and beyond are still dying from COVID. But we saw such drastic economic side effects. There were many, but perhaps the biggest one was the extreme job loss. And though we've seen a lot of jobs bounce back, when that happened, people went into serious debt just to get by. And debt, as you know, is not something you just snap your fingers and make it go away. There are effective strategies to pay it down, but usually they take a lot of time. So that alone makes everything more expensive because people are already spending money they don't quite have. Um, that debt lingers, and it's important to highlight that people of color and women were most profoundly hit by the pandemic in terms of economic consequences. So therefore, they're going to be dealing with this brunt even more severely.
I'm thinking about, I don't know, you said you want to stay away. Maybe you mentioned something that was a political thing and you mentioned the debt. What has been the voice of Go Banking Rates as you go into this election season, right? Because so much of this is the economy. So much of this is, people's feeling of inflation, how that's impacting them, and how we bounced back from COVID in good ways and in bad ways. So how are you as a team, and maybe you specifically looking at that informing your stories for the next couple of months?
Yeah. Well, one thing at Go Banking Rates that we really highlight, and we have a disclaimer in every single one of our political pieces, is that we're an objective space. We are not supporting one over another. So that's out the gate. So we have to be extremely mindful when we're quoting sources not to let their opinions sideline what we're talking about. So, I mean, there are cases where you get someone, you're talking about affordable healthcare, and they're incredibly focused on talking about why affordable healthcare, for example, is not good, and they're a pro candidate that would eliminate that or lessen it. So those are tricky. You're not going to not quote someone because of their perspective, but you have to be really clear in your own reportage and your own, prose, what you're writing in the story, to remind of facts and say, this is how many people use affordable care. This is what this candidate has done in the past. This is what the other candidate wants to do. So it's really about striking a balance and not coming off in a way that reflects who you're voting for.
Right. So then you mentioned people, like who you're quoting, who you're not quoting. What is the typical experience you have for how you work with sources, how you work with all these different companies that want to get mentioned or people that want to get quoted, right? So many people think of journalists as, I need to get to them so that I can get my voice out there. I'm sure you're getting bombarded every day with lots of pitches.
Yes. One thing I will say is that knowing a journalist does not does not necessarily help you get coverage. I get a lot of outreach on LinkedIn of people saying, I just want to connect. I just want to connect. I just want to connect. And I accept their requests, but it doesn't change anything. A compelling pitch can come from a stranger. Quite often it does. A company I haven't heard of that I have to look into and make sure that they're, an expert in the space. So yeah, I mean it's an inundation all the time, but you I when I do my own outreach, my own pitches, which is most of my stories are my pitches. I have a lot of success on Quoted. The app Connectively, formerly known as Haro, has become trash, and it's actually not just
Tell me
trash.
more. Why has it become trash? Tell me.
Oh, there are people who catfish on there. That is extremely common. They'll pose as a valid source, and then turns out they are not who they say they are. You get tons of spam, people who say they are experts in plumbing, but then you look them up and they're like, I don't know, an expert in light bulbs or something. Like it's just that's not even a good example. Like it's more extreme than that. Quoted, on the other hand, you're working primarily with PR people who are who've already sort of vetted their source, so that you still have to vet the source and make sure they are who say they are and make sure they work for a company that's relevant to what you're writing, but it does take out a lot of the headache. So Quoted all the way, and they have a really good database and they're easy to communicate with if you have an issue. So I do rely on them quite a bit if I'm in a scramble to get sources.
You mentioned most of the pitches are your pitches. Is that in terms of when you're getting assigned a story, or are you not assigned a story? Is it up to you to come up with these 16 stories a week, whatever you want to write on?
Yeah, so every now and then I am assigned a piece, particularly if someone's out or something else like that's going on. But we pitch our own stories. Each of us is expected to pitch a pretty large amount of data-backed, unique stories every month. Right now, I would say I pitch about anywhere from 70 to 125 a month. And whatever gets approved from that, I usually claim for myself since I've already done some research on the title. And that's what I go forth and execute.
Right, right. What do you find is if there, you could define what's a good story? I've heard someone say a good story is something that surprises me. I've heard people talk about stories that have some kind of conflict, right? Personalities and drama, etc. How would you define what is a classic good Nicole story?
Well, I think there are so many different types of stories. And if I'm doing an investigative journalism piece, for instance, which wouldn't apply to GOBankingRates, that would be something that has twists and turns. That would be something where you meet a source who maybe is a whistleblower, where again, I think what you mentioned, that surprise element, I think suspense, yourself being riveted and feeling like maybe you're a little bit of a character in the story too. But with the kind of journalism I'm mainly doing now, primarily with GOBankingRates, a good story is something that's well structured, that feels complete, that leaves you a little bit curious about your own situation, and ideally a little more confident about going forward in your financial life.
You write a lot about people that have had success at different ages. Do you ever think, oh, what are some ideas that I could steal from them and do in my own life?
Um, you know, I don't know that I could do a lot of the things that people that I write about are doing. Like, I just don't think I have the interest. Like, I don't want to launch a startup, for example, or I don't want to become a social media influencer. And it's not because I look down on these jobs at all. I just don't think I'd be very good at them. I mean, I think I would just kind of suck at them. So, unfortunately, I'm pretty committed to journalism, despite the industry's challenges and threats. Although, on the note of threats, I don't think AI is going to be quite as devastating as we've anticipated. I think we're going to increasingly use it as a tool as opposed to the talent. And I think we're also starting to see this is that we kind of hyped it up a little too much. It's yes, it can pass the bar exam, but it also gives you terribly outdated data and still sounds like a total weirdo robot. Um, so yeah, I guess back to your question, I don't think there's anything else I can do.
What what is a story that you think is not getting enough attention in the general financial media? Something that you wish more journalists would be writing about?
Yeah, I think that I would, I mean, a big part of me wants to focus more on humanitarian issues and psychology and aspects of culture. And I don't think that has to be separate from financial. I think we can talk more about how to afford mental health, how to create opportunities for people experiencing poverty. I think that we can have just smarter stuff in general and less so and so stuns in 7-piece bikini with a margarita in hand and wearing a leopard sun hat. I mean, these crazy long stupid titles that are dominating news feeds. So if we could be devoting our energy to something that's just clearly more important and more resonant, that would be a very good thing.
What about feedback? How, when you do your stories, how are you getting feedback? Is it people commenting, sending you emails, direct Twitter responses? How does the public interact with your stories once it's been published?
Yeah, social media, definitely there's engagement there. I don't do a lot of work with social media. I'll do like LinkedIn posts or Reddit posts, but I'm not someone who's, aside from LinkedIn, I'm not really in my own self-promotion, frankly, or promotion of my team members. I'm not doing a lot of one-on-one interactions with people. So, but yeah, I would say social media is probably the biggest contributor. We do get a lot of emails, and of course, when our sources post the stories on their social networks, and that in itself creates a dialogue. And we usually get really good feedback. But also, we open a lot of doors to people who are just like, you know, really crazy for coverage, and they don't necessarily accept that storming a journalist with with your sources is going to be effective. It can frankly be really annoying.
It can definitely be annoying. You and I know, you and I know. What would you say is not annoying, but actually useful then? For
Yeah.
people who are trying to say, tell me what to do, but don't tell me what I shouldn't do, but tell me what I should do.
Send me exclusive research that's relevant to what I cover. Um, don't send me exclusive research that if you're, we had like a cannabis company send like a very, somewhat in-depth financial study. And I'm like, but you're a cannabis company. Like what, so send me research that's exclusive, unique, relevant, timely. Introduce sources and tell me exactly what they want to talk about and try to make what they want to talk about a little bit angled. Like, let me know, oh, they can talk about how to help your teen become a millionaire. Like, that's really interesting, and that's not something that we've seen done. In fact, I might pitch that, but I'm just saying, like, show me something like what can they talk about as opposed to just like my source can talk about mortgages. Like, that's not
Yeah, like what about mortgages? Yeah.
right. Right.
Yeah, there's too much sort of blah and plainness and vanilla commentary. Or what gets me are the people that say, "Oh, the story out there, I agree with what they're saying." It's like, okay, well, if you agree, like, why am I
Yeah,
gonna keep doing story?
and also, I mean, the concept of agreeing is murky. If a source comes in, all shoulders with some big opinion that isn't rooted in fact, and they just agree with this opinion, that's a red flag.
Right, right. I'm trying to think, what else should I be asking? You're so crystal clear in your answers. There's no ums, there's no knows and likes. You're very crystal clear, and you're not spewing very long answers. So it's been fun to keep coming up with different questions to ask you. Because some people, you talk to them, they give you a 7-minute answer, and You forget what the original question was.
Well, I probably veered in some cases, but your question about debt, I think I was way off course. But uh, one quick thing I want to say is that one of the real, well, you could call it a perk, you can call it a tragedy. One of the thing that's really resonant about financial journalism is that we kind of all need it. We're all a little or a lot worried about money, even if we have a ton of it. So that aspect of working in this space is very compelling to me.
Yeah, we're all worried about money. That's a good point. Have you ever met someone who's not worried about money?
I don't think so. Well, that's not true. I've met a lot of trust fund kids who I don't think have ever been exposed to anything financial. I mean, I knew one trust funder, of course, I won't disclose his name, who'd never been on the subway, and he was 28, and he lived in
Never
Manhattan.
even once been on it.
And he lived in Manhattan, yeah. So not even as a kid. So, I mean, there are some people who are so incredibly sheltered that I don't think they even understand. Another trust funder, this is just like turned into the trust funder podcast, once lost his wallet when I was out with him, and he just called his dad's office and made it their problem. So it's just I guess there are those people, but they're few and far between, and usually they you wouldn't want to be them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is good. Nicole, I appreciate the time today. Thanks for sharing a little bit of insight in terms of how you're thinking about stories, how you want to work with people who want to get their message out there, and what you're trying to avoid. And yeah, the money world is just so interesting because especially right now with this economy, the election coming up, people really have this top of mind. And I think a lot of people you're seeing, like you said, there are a lot of people who are making a lot of money right now if they're invested in the right stocks at all-time highs. And there are a lot of people who have not been able to participate in those gains, and they're really struggling right now.
Absolutely. And I don't see that lifting with rising costs of living and minimum wages failing to keep up with them. But I do hope, even though there's a lot of financial anxiety around this election, that people will think more about the bigger issues, women's rights, DEI, these, healthcare that's accessible, first world issues that are no brainers in other first world countries.
Nicole, thank you. I appreciate the time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.